Sid Meier's Civilization has been almost a subgenre unto itself for over 30 years. In its very specific niche of historic turn-based 4X strategy games, Civilization hasn't only been the top dog on the block, it has kind of been the only dog. Yeah, there have been plenty of other turn-based 4X strategy games, but most of those have been sci-fi or fantasy themed. There are the classics like Master of Orion, and Steam is littered with games like Galactic Civilizations, Endless Space, Endless Legends, Dominions, Age of Wonders, Age of Mythology, and so forth. And of course, there are plenty of other historic strategy games that aren't strictly turn-based. Games like Age of Empires, Total War, Rise of Nations, Europa Universalis, Crusader Kings, and so forth. These games offer plenty of overlap with Civilization, and they all probably have plenty of appeal for fans of the Civilization series. I, for one, really love the Total War series, and I've played every installation of that series between Empire and Attila. I bought Three Kingdoms, but I just haven't gotten around to playing it yet. And then there's also, I think, a Pharaoh one, which I also have not played yet. But these games just don't quite scratch the same itch for me as Civilization does, with its very specific combination of turn-based 4X strategy with a historic theme. If you wanted that specific kind of gameplay and thematic experience, you had to play Civilization. But in recent years, that has finally started to change, as more developers and publishers have finally started to take up the task of trying to challenge Civilization for its almost completely undisputed throne. Games like Humankind from Amplitude Studios, Old World from Mohawk, Ara History Untold from Microsoft, Millennia from Paradox, and others have all started trickling out over the past 5 years or so. For the first time in its decades-long history as a franchise, Civilization VII released into a crowded marketplace of competition in its very specific gameplay niche. For the first time, a new Civilization game had to compete with games that weren't just past Civilization games. This means that for the first time in its history as a franchise, the developers of a new Civilization game actually have very specific and relevant lessons that they can learn from other games that occupy the same market space. For example, is Civilization VII's decision to allow players to change their civilization over the course of the game a direct result of inspiration from Amplitude's Humankind? Or is it just a coincidental example of convergent design, with both games independently trying to solve the same problem or criticism of past Civ games and coming to a very similar solution? Only the people at Firaxis and 2K Games truly know the answer, and maybe I'll talk about that particular comparison in a future video. In this video, however, I want to take a look at one such comparison between Civilization and one of its other rookie peers, and what each game can potentially learn from each other. The specific game in question here is Microsoft's Ara History Untold. Civilization VII and Ara History Untold are very different games, but they actually have multiple examples of convergent design. Both games were released within about 5 months of each other, so I highly doubt that either game stole any ideas from each other. Instead, I'm fairly confident in saying that these games are good examples of coincidental convergent design. Both games utilize a district placing mechanic, with multiple buildings being able to be built within the same tile, and then you upgrade those buildings in later eras. Both games group military units into armies that move around the map in stacks. Both games have a limited number of cities that a civilization can build at any given time during the game. Both games put an increased emphasis, at least compared to their contemporaries, on collecting resources and using those resources for various and specific purposes within specific cities. Any of these could have been interesting topics of discussion on their own, and I actually will talk about some of them as they relate to the specific topic of this video. But for this video, the specific point of convergent design that I want to discuss is how both Civilization VII and Ara History Untold divide their games up into 3 distinct acts, or ages. Both games divide human history into 3 distinct epochs: an ancient or antiquity epoch, a Middle Ages or Enlightenment epoch, and an industrial or modern epoch. Both games have hard stops in between each of these epochs, in which the progress of each civilization is scored and evaluated, and various aspects of the game and the map reset. So today I want to talk about why these games make this very specific choice, how their implementations differ, and what each game can potentially learn from the other. I also want to emphasize that both Ara and Civ 7 have recently received major updates that may have revised these mechanics in direct response to criticisms of those mechanics. I haven't played enough of either game since these changes have been released, and so I will not be able to discuss them in much detail. So I'm going to be talking specifically about how each game worked when it was released. So if you're playing either game now, they might play very differently from how I am about to describe them. So why do Ara and Civilization VII divide their game up into these three distinct parts? Well, both are being done to facilitate some kind of scoring system, and both seem intended to break long games up into smaller, almost mini-games that can be played and completed on their own or in sequence with a hard stopping point in between. And to some degree, they both serve as a rubber banding mechanic, attempting to put all the civilizations back on somewhat even footing at the start of each epoch in order to help games stay more competitive into the mid and late game. They are both also done in order to slightly change up the game mechanics so that the mechanics and gameplay objectives are more relevant to the current epoch and the technologies and cultural developments therein. Each epoch has different government types, different units with different combat tactics, and different resources that do different things. But these broad similarities give way to very different specific implementations. Despite their surface-level similarities, Ara and Civilization VII have some pretty significant differences in how they approach their three-act structures. Ara uses its act transitions largely as a way of culling out the worst-performing civilizations from the game. During each act, civilizations accumulate scores for various achievements and activities in various categories, such as scientific advancement, infrastructure development, economic success, or military conquest. These scores are added together at the start of each act, and the lowest scoring civilizations are actually removed from the game going into the next act. Their cities and districts are reduced to ruins, and their armies become roving bands of barbarian mercenaries. This player elimination mechanic has several effects on strategy and game pacing. For one thing, it creates an explicit fail state for civilizations that stagnate too much. The game pressures each and every player to continue to expand, develop, and conquer in order to keep your score, at the very least, above that elimination threshold. You cannot get complacent in Ara, and the ability to turtle is limited by this score competition with all the other players. Fall too far behind, and you risk being eliminated from the game early, even if you are not explicitly conquered or defeated by another player's military. The player elimination also frees up space on the map and opens up new rounds of exploration and treasure hunting. Previously claimed territory suddenly becomes available for the surviving civilizations to colonize for themselves, without necessarily having to invade and conquer those lands. You can play a peaceful, pacifist, diplomatic strategy and still be able to claim new lands in the mid and late game. The city caps do not increase much, if at all, going into a new act, so the newly opened map spaces give smaller civilizations an opportunity to claim new land and potentially catch up to the larger, more powerful civilizations. The ruins of fallen civilizations will also hold treasures similar to the goody huts that can be found during exploration at the beginning of the game. This means that every civilization is motivated to send their explorers out to scavenge former rival territory for free treasures and yields. But you do need to protect those explorers, since the roving armies of those fallen empires will look to attack and kill any explorers or units or settlers that try to plunder or settle their ancestral heritage. I don't know about you, but my favorite part of any 4X game is the early exploration and settling at the beginning. I love uncovering the map, meeting new people, finding what resources are available to me, and planning out the sites for my first few cities. The player elimination mechanic in Ara kind of recreates a little bit of this early game exploration during the start of the second and third acts. Civilization VII also scores each civilization during its age transition, but it does not eliminate weak or failing nations from the game the way that Ara does. If you lose a game of Civilization VII, it's going to be because you are conquered or because another player completed an endgame victory condition in the final age before you do. Instead, an age transition in Civilization VII requires each player to select a new civilization for the upcoming age, since each civilization in Civilization VII is only playable in its one specific age. And the score that you earn throughout an age is not a generic amalgamation of points earned by completing a variety of tasks. Instead, Civilization VII awards bonus buffs to civilizations who completed one or more legacy paths during the previous age. The game does kind of rank the civilizations based on the cumulative total of the points they earned towards all legacies combined, but it has much more discrete victory conditions for each age that you either achieve or you don't. Civilization VII does impose limits on how many cities each civilization can control in each age, and this limit increases for each new age and can be further increased by researching certain technologies or civics. This city limit ensures that there is still valuable real estate available to civilizations in each new age without having to explicitly attack or eliminate other players. Also, the legacy paths of Civilization VII doesn't put civilizations in direct competition with one another the way that Ara does. All of the legacies can technically be completed by multiple civilizations, and it is common for more than one civilization to complete the same legacy path by the end of an age, especially if you're playing with long ages. Though some legacies, like the Seven Wonders of the Ancient World and the Treasure Fleets, are much harder for multiple civilizations to complete in a single game due to the limited nature of wonders in antiquity and the limited number of distant land that can generate treasure resources in the exploration age. But there is no hard rule that prohibits multiple civs from competing for these legacies. With enough wonders from DLCs and large enough maps from future updates, these limitations become kind of moot, and it'll be much easier for multiple civilizations to be able to complete these particular legacies in a single game. Instead of a hard player elimination at the end of an act, Civilization VII concludes its ages with a crisis. These are one of several prefabricated end-of-age challenges designed to shake up the status quo and potentially knock some civs down a peg or two. It's kind of like a boss fight, almost. Or at least it is in principle. One other way that these two games are similar is that these features of both games were very controversial and divisive at launch, with both developers opting to add options to turn aspects of them off entirely. And both are still seeing major revisions to these mechanics at the time that I'm putting this video essay together. Both games are still largely considered works in progress by their developers and player communities, and likely will continue to be so for quite a while longer, and will probably change considerably in the months and years to come. But I really don't like this approach of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater by completely pivoting the game's design away from these fundamental aspects of the developer's original vision. Even for people who don't like these mechanics, I think there is value in exploring what works and what doesn't in these controversial designs, and to see if there are ways that they can be iterated upon. Maybe they can be fixed by patches, by paid expansions, or in future sequels. And maybe they can become beloved elements of the game's design that add depth, challenge, and maybe even realism to the game. Let's see if these mechanics are salvageable before we abandon them entirely. Both Ara and Civilization VII received some well-due criticism for these design choices, and both games' communities have been very divided over whether these features are good ideas at all. For some people, they are fundamentally bad mechanics because they don't let players play the way that they want to play. Do you want to play a small turtle nation in Ara? Well, you may not be able to score enough points to avoid the culling at the end of an act. Do you want to lead the Babylonians or Aztecs from antiquity into the space age in Civilization VII? Well, you can't. For one thing, neither the Babylonians nor the Aztecs are playable civilizations in the game at the time of this writing and recording, but even if they were, the game forces you to change civilizations for each new age. You can't choose to keep the same civ in a new age, the way that you can in, for example, Humankind. For some players, these alone can be deal breakers for these games. But whether these are problems comes down largely to personal preference. But there are also more objective design problems with both games' approaches to dividing history up into 3 epochs. Perhaps my biggest gripe with both games is the suddenness of these age transitions. At the end of an act in Ara, the culled civilizations are removed from the game instantly, between the final turn of the previous act and the first turn of the new act. These empires don't gradually collapse, nor are they conquered or defeated in any traditional sense. Their whole nation just collapses into ruins and dust overnight. But at least Ara gives players a definitive countdown before the act ends, so players know how long they have left and have the opportunity to try to score some last-minute points to put them over the threshold for culling. Civilization VII, at least at release, did not grant that same luxury, though such a feature has been patched in the meantime. There is an age progress indicator in the top right that gives a percentage of how complete the age is, and that's been there since the game released. But this percentage would move in fits and spurts, and can jump 5 to 10 points in a single turn, depending on the actions of the various civilizations in the game. Once the tracker gets above 90%, the age can pretty much end at any moment, and you won't know that it's happening until it happens. Again, that was the case at release, it's not the case anymore. Further, when an age ends, the game just stops. The next age begins at a predetermined date on the in-game calendar. This means that depending on how quickly the civs powered through the objectives for an age, a game of Civilization VII might literally skip hundreds or thousands of years of its in-game history. It's not uncommon for the Antiquity Age to end in something like 1600 BCE, only for the Exploration Age to begin in 400 CE, completely skipping 2,000 years of in-game history. That's 2,000 in-game years in which you do not get to settle new cities, build wonders, befriend or annex independent peoples, fight wars, or explore more of the map. Perhaps this is why Ara doesn't even bother to assign specific years to its turns. It opts instead to label periods of the game with broad eras. Each act in Ara is further divided up into 3 eras, which each have an early and late period. So in Ara, a given turn does not take place in 1600 BCE, it would simply be called the Early Bronze Age instead. As such, the exact amount of time that a given turn represents in Ara is ambiguous. The game overall feels much more seamless than Civ 7 because of this, with act transitions not feeling like they are skipping over chunks of history the way that Civ 7's age transitions do, even though, as I said before, the civilizations that are culled just disappear overnight. Another big difference is that as an age in Civilization VII approaches its end, it triggers a crisis that throws a wrench into the player's march to the finish line. These crises seem to be intended to act as a sort of boss fight, to test the robustness and adaptability of each civilization. Unfortunately, this mechanic doesn't quite work out that way. At least at release, the game doesn't really provide enough options for the player to realistically adapt to serious threats posed by these crises, and so their effects seem to have been toned down considerably so as to not feel unfairly punishing. For example, the removal of citizens that work individual tiles mean that you can't change the yields produced by cities in order to offset penalties imposed by the crisis. Nor can you reassign specialists to different jobs. Nor can you trade resources, gold, or try to declare joint war declarations with other leaders. Nor can you change your government to react to a specific challenge, though you can change some of your policies. These crises also feel like they come out of nowhere. They don't feel like they are the result of poor empire management or overexpansion. They are just arbitrary challenges that feel like they are either trivial to deal with if you are already in a good position, or that might feel impossible to mitigate due to the inability to shift your empire's output or governance, or to seek help from trade partners and allies. And you just have to tank it. It's always one extreme or the other, and there's rarely, at least in my experience, much if any in between. And you can just tank the crisis, because the crisis does not actually need to be resolved or defeated in any way in order to graduate from the age. If enough civs make progress down the various legacy paths or by researching future techs and future civics, the age will just conclude and the crisis will just end without any proper climax or resolution, even if you didn't do anything to try to mitigate or resolve it. It all feels very underbaked. So now that we've identified what are, at least in my opinion, the core weaknesses of both of these games, what could they potentially learn from each other in order to improve their respective Act and Ages system? For both games, the Act or Age transition happens abruptly with little or no context. In the case of Ara, whole civilizations disappear off the face of the planet overnight, while in Civilization VII, an arbitrary crisis happens that often feels trivial or meaningless. But what if we combined both of these games' epoch transitions together in such a way that each game's strengths could perhaps override their respective weaknesses? I'm envisioning a mashup of Civilization VII and Ara History Untold, such that an end-of-age crisis actually does serve as a true boss fight, with a pass-or-fail condition, in which failing to successfully resolve the crisis is the thing that leads to a civilization falling and being culled out of the game at the end of that respective epoch. Having a high score or successfully completing legacy paths could serve to insulate a civilization from the crisis, either by contributing towards the successful completion of the crisis preemptively, or by reducing the threshold for passing that crisis, or by mitigating some of its more harsh effects so that it is easier to pass. That way, your progress earlier in the game and your achievements have a meaningful impact on your ability to complete the age or the act. Maybe everyone can potentially pass the crisis and survive into the next epoch. Or maybe there is always a certain number of civilizations that must be culled, and the pass condition is simply to do better than the worst civilizations. Either way, your progress and points throughout the epoch should still matter. A civilization who does nothing of note throughout an epoch would have a much more of an uphill battle to survive the crisis, but it would still be possible for that civilization to survive if it performs exceptionally well during the crisis, or if other civs perform exceptionally poorly. This idea does several things to address the problems that I've enumerated with each game. First and foremost, it provides additional context for why civilizations survive an epoch or why they might have fallen. A civilization that gets culled doesn't simply vanish overnight, it would suffer a period of decline during the crisis that directly results in the civilization collapsing. Whether that crisis is disease, revolt, natural disaster, barbarian invasions, economic depressions, or whatever other crises the developers come up with, there would be a reason for why a particular civilization did not survive into the next epoch of history. This could also make the crises themselves more meaningful. Failure to adequately address a crisis can result in elimination from the game, meaning that players cannot ignore a crisis, cannot simply tank through it, and must take steps to address whatever problems the crisis imposes. This, of course, means that the game's mechanics must provide ways for a player to meaningfully address the crisis. It can't be something that you're expected to just tank through, or that you're just going to fail because there's no meaningful way for your current civilization to adapt to it. Furthermore, the crises could be designed to happen between the ages instead of at the end of an age. This would resolve the abruptness of an age transition and would make the in-between periods playable, filling in the gaps in the timeline and making the game feel more seamless. So instead of ending the Antiquity Age in 1600 BCE and then jumping immediately to 400 CE, that time period between 1600 BCE and 400 CE would be the crisis. Hopefully the crisis wouldn't last that long, preferably the crises would be, a shorter period of time, but the point that we would have a seamless game and not these huge jumps between hundreds or thousands of years would be the main point here. Whether or not you like Civilization VII or Ara History Untold, or you hate them, or if you land anywhere in between, I hope that you stuck with this little examination and thought experiment, and I thank those of you who did, and I hope that you come out of this with a new appreciation for the potential that these mechanics have, and that you are open to the idea of iterating on these ideas and giving Firaxis and Oxide games an opportunity to try out 2.0 versions before we all collectively give up on the idea entirely. I think there is potential for these mechanics to create very interesting dynamics in their respective games. They have the potential to put pressure on players to not stagnate. They also have the potential to add challenges to the game that are not derived directly from the CPU-controlled rivals who, let's face it, tend not to play these games super well. They are the latest efforts in a series of attempts to discourage overexpansion or unsustainable conquest, along with relatively recent mechanics like Civilization VI's loyalty and natural disasters. I, for one, definitely think that there is merit in how these epoch divisions try to recreate the excitement of early game exploration within the mid and late game. I also think there is merit in creating shorter, goal-driven mini-games that can be played in an hour or two and which can facilitate more multiplayer matches that end with a satisfying resolution instead of just petering out because it's 2 a.m. and people have to go to work in the morning. Maybe there are better ways to achieve these goals than dividing the game up into distinct ages, or maybe this is a good solution, but it just needs more time in the oven to be fully baked. If only one of these studios or the other had come up with this idea and it just didn't work, it would be a lot easier to dismiss. But the fact that multiple different studios each independently came up with such similar solutions to similar problems, well, then maybe there is something to this idea. Thanks for watching.